Hello, folks, and thanks for joining us at this Orange Cyber Defense session. Wherever you're joining us from, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night. We have people from all around the world joining us on this session, and we are, of course, going to be discussing the SolarWinds attack. We're going to be chasing the storm. Even if you know a lot about this, even if you think you know everything about this, I hope you're going to discover something new about the attack during this session. And even if you do know everything, if you have NSA-like powers and visibility across this, there's of course all of the fallout and the ramifications and the implications of it, which go far wider than just the technicalities of the attack and go into things like policy and politics and so on. And we're going to be discussing all of those things, getting into all of those areas. There's much to discuss, and I, for one, can't wait to start discussing it. We've got a fantastic panel, as always, with Orange Cyber Defense. We are joined by their head of research, Charles van der Veld, and their Director of Strategy and Public Affairs, Nicolas Arpesian. Charles and Nicolas, hello, both of you.
Hello, Jeff. Hello, Charles.
Hey, hi, Bo. Thanks for having us. Hello, everyone.
So, Charles, I want to start with you. I mean, I find this just endlessly fascinating, and the reading I've done still leaves a great deal of murk around the SolarWinds attack. So, just so we're all on the same page, can you just map out what we know, where the gaps might be?
Sure, Jeff. Look, murk is probably the right word. I think we're all facing a great deal of murk, and as you'll see, I think as the discussion progresses, I feel strongly that's kind of one of the major issues that we're dealing with. So very much is still unknown, certainly by the rest of us in the public domain. But if we take a look at the timeline of events, I think that's a good place to start. There are a few things that we know now and that are relatively well understood. The first thing we understand is that the campaign, in some form or another, started as far back as like 2.5 years ago, where the domain that was used for the command and control server was registered. Now, we don't know if it was registered with this particular operation in mind, but we know that whoever registered it was operating at that time. Maybe we can switch to the next slide with a picture of the timeline on it. The next thing we know is that the initial compromise of SolarWinds occurred in early September of 2019. So regardless of the age of the command and control domain, the operation itself was in active progress as far back as that. We still don't know for sure how that happened. Two allegations or two theories. One is that there was a physical insert or some sort of physical compromise at a satellite developer office in somewhere in Eastern Europe. And the other is that it was via another supply chain attack, funnily enough, of the JetBrains software. Neither of those have been proven. I think we're just speculating at this point. Having compromised SolarWinds, they then moved to start distributing their backdoor to SolarWinds clients. That probably happened around March of 2020. And then they were only discovered a full 9 months later in December when FireEye pulled the plug. So that's kind of in terms of the timeline. If I have a bit more time and we can jump to the next slide, we can just talk a little bit more about the technical detail of the attack. So the first thing we know is, as I said, they compromised SolarWinds. Having compromised SolarWinds, they used a proprietary, a custom piece of malware that inserted itself into what's called the build process, which is really the combination of people, platform, and technology that takes the source code that all the developers produce, bundles it up, compiles it, puts it into an installer, and makes it available for SolarWinds' clients to download. So one of the DLLs in that bundled up package, signed digitally with SolarWinds' certificate, was then actually contained a backdoor. If that software was downloaded by a client, if the client installed it, and if they ran it, then eventually this DLL would be triggered and the backdoor would attempt to beacon out onto the internet. Now there's some ifs, buts, and maybes about whether that would be successful. But if it was successful, it would then download a third payload, which we're talking about 3 now, that would give the attackers what they're referring to as hands-on keyboards, which is basically like they're reaching through your firewall and they're now typing on your computer keyboard effectively. And they would then use that access, and then various contemporary pretty well understood techniques to move laterally, elevate privileges, etc. And in some cases, then also to glean access via the compromised on-prem systems to cloud technologies in the Microsoft environment, using the SAML authentication framework, which kind of allows you to pass tokens around for authentication. And so they ended up in Office 365 and M365 environments for some of the victims. I think we have one more slide that I can just wrap up with, just regarding the victimology. So we know that SolarWinds has in the region of 300,000 customers for their Orion network management platform. According to SolarWinds, around 18,000 of those clients did the right thing and downloaded the new version of the software, which unbeknownst to them then also included this backdoor. What we don't know is from the 18,000, how many then actually installed it, and how many cases that the backdoor DLL fired and was able to beacon out. And even if it did beacon out and the attackers had hands on keyboards, whether they had the capacity to then actually spend time, or we don't know. We're tracking it. We're trying to keep track of it. Our estimate is that we're now shifting past 109 confirmed victims. And just to put that into perspective, sorry,
that number's
Jeff,
actually crept up, hasn't it? That number's gradually crept up as this story's gone on.
Yeah. So the original news report speculated about in excess of 200. So here I'm talking about where we're pretty convinced that that victim has been confirmed. And just to give you a sense of that, those are big names. So we already mentioned Microsoft. They were compromised, access to source code downloaded. We know that FireEye was compromised. They're the ones that eventually triggered the alarm. We know that several US government agencies were compromised, including fc.gov and some army domains, and as well as other government agencies and defense agencies. And then we've got guys like Cisco, guys like Qualys, guys like Cox. Chevron Texaco is in there, Logitech is in there, Palo Alto Networks is in there, and the list just goes on and on and on. It's big names, not just many, but very significant players.
Yeah. Somebody I was speaking to about this suggested that what was remarkable about this was that after all was said and done, this was kind of a credential stealing attack. Eventually, the ultimate aim was to steal credentials they could use to log into Microsoft cloud services or cloud services generally. So it was in a way a very, very extravagant, very successful and technically complicated, but ultimately the end result was, can I steal creds and can I log in as somebody? Is that assessment correct?
I think that's a way you can look at it. What the ultimate goal was and what the ultimate outcome is are two different things, and we don't know for sure. When you're dealing with espionage, which is the kind of allegation around this attack, then of course that would be a goal. That would be the logical route to follow. You get access as a person, you get access to the files and data that they can access. What I would say, and where I think you're right, is you can kind of put two lenses on this. The one is you can look at the supply chain aspect and the fact that these second-tier customers were popped via a trusted software component. And then you can look at the lateral movement and privilege escalation component, which persisted over those nine months. Now, that component doesn't strike me as being fundamentally unique in what they were doing. It's the same thing that a sophisticated pen tester would do in your environment. However, clearly done with a degree of je ne sais quoi, because they managed to get away with it for so long without being spotted. Even in those big players.
It's Ask the Audience time. We've got a couple of polls which we would like to put your way for viewers of the webinar. So if you wouldn't mind indulging us in this, we're going to be asking you a couple of questions just to get a sounding from you. Our first one: has your company been directly impacted by the SolarWinds breach? Obviously, all polls are anonymous. We won't be taking any names on this, but please cast your votes there if you would in the polls section, which you'll see on your right-hand side on your little chat window. And let us know the answer. That would be fascinating to hear what the answers to that are. Because, I mean, to just jump ahead of that question, Charles, I guess one of the impacts of this is working out whether you've been whether you've been compromised by this at all. I mean, SolarWinds have been quite public about this and say they were reaching out to customers. So would anyone affected by this have found out by now? What's the current state of play?
I think, Jeff, it's the most interesting and potentially the most impactful element of this whole incident. Is if we think of the 18,000 names that are on the original potential targets list, and then we think of the 109 that are on the confirmed victims list, that leaves us with a gap of, what is it, 17,891 or something. Yeah. 81, 91. Then that's a big unknown. That is businesses that are now sitting in the position where they need to reach some point of confidence that they weren't right. Now, clearly, a number of them would have said, look, we never installed the software, so we feel confident. But a number of them would have installed that software, and by virtue of that are in the potential victims list. And
yeah,
I can see the results of the poll now, and speaking frankly, I'm intrigued by that 60% who say no, because because I want to know how you don't know, without sounding facetious, but in my mind, it's very hard to prove a negative.
Yeah, just interesting. Just to address that, we have time at the end for question and answers on this topic. So please do stay with us and ask questions at the end. And if you have got a way of knowing that you haven't been affected, then, well, I suppose you could say, well, we didn't use SolarWinds. That's maybe the answer to that one. But given how huge a vendor they are, that's it's really interesting. We've got another poll. Actually, let's do that after this next section. I want to talk, Charles, about the impact of this, the actual impact of the attack. So beyond just the sort of technicalities and app breakout itself, where does this go beyond just the immediate impact of the aftermath of the SolarWinds attack?
Yeah, why don't we flip to the next slide, because I think that summarizes it. But really, what I want people, what I would call people to do is to try and take themselves back a decade or so to the 2009 Stuxnet attack. Jeff, you know this probably better than I do. But it was a supply chain attack like this one. They got code running on the PLCs that were running these nuclear centrifuges. And the code started messing with the behavior of the centrifuges. But not only that, they did a classic movie style record and playback attack, where they recorded telemetry from these centrifuges over a period of 6 weeks, I believe, and then played it back to the monitoring systems that were running on engineers' computers. And I really I just find the notion so fascinating of an engineer sitting there watching this centrifuge kind of spinning off its bearings and doing all kinds of ballet that it's not supposed to do. And then looking at the computer screen, and the computer screen says, we're good, okay, it's all systems go, it's green light. And what that must have done to his psyche and his relationship with technology, or her relationship with technology, when you realize, hang on, this thing, it's not mine. It's not behaving the way it's supposed to. Someone else is messing with it. And how that seed of doubt must spread, right? Like, how do you know if this thing's misbehaving, then what about that thing? And what about this? And can I read my email? And, is my home computer okay? And what about the other nuclear plants? And nobody would have known. And that the impact of an attack like this, for me, is on trust. So can we assert that we can trust our technology, that it's not under the control of someone else, that it's not backdoored, that it's not doing whatever it shouldn't be doing? I think what's interesting about SolarWinds is that because any one of those 18,000 could have been affected, and because if you really apply yourself, you can't prove a negative, right? You can say, okay, I've checked for the IOCs and I don't see the IOCs, and therefore I think I'm okay. But in the back of your mind, it's got to be, but hang on, I ran this stuff. And the only way you could really be okay is then to say, well, okay, we're going to pull our version down, we're going to run it backwards, we're going to, do all kinds of things. So the cost of this attack, in my mind, isn't on the 109 victims that we know. It's on that 17,891 victims that don't know, and everyone who's associated with them, right? Everyone who uses their technology. What if their software suppliers? We know from Microsoft that 40% of the victims that they worked with were in the information space, in the IT space, service providers, software manufacturers, etc. So like, where does it stop? And so a breach of trust is is contagious. It spreads like a virus. And Jeff, you would have heard me say it frequently before. I was fascinated, again, about a decade ago. This crowd at Cambridge University published a report called the Sybil Logic Bomb Project, where they hypothesized about exactly a scenario like this. Supply chain attack, database or data analytics platform goes undetected 15 months. Ironic, 15 months it goes undetected. And what it's doing is it's messing with data. It's changing the outputs and columns and, shifting decimals and all kinds of things. And eventually 15 months later, everybody realizes this has happened. And the Cambridge guys then kind of model out how this contagious loss of trust then impacts business, where people say, well, we can't trust this database. We can't trust the data it produces. We can't trust the technologies and the processes that run off the data. We don't want to be in that business. They eject, people get fired. And they predict an enormous, like multi-trillion-dollar impact on the global economy as a result of that. Now, I'm not saying SolarWinds is that, but it looks very close, and I think at least it should be a wake-up call to us about the reality that something like that could happen.
Interesting. In terms of the impact, let's have a second. We've got a second poll to throw in front of our viewers, if you wouldn't mind. As I say, all results are anonymous, so we want to ask you about the impact, the wider impact of the SolarWinds attack. So even if you haven't been caught up in it directly, or don't think you have, if you haven't been directly impacted, has it caused any indirect impact on your time focus or your resources? So have you been asked about it? Have you done investigations? Have you questioned your partners or suppliers? Interesting question. All of the above or none of the above. So if you wouldn't mind hitting the button to see which one of those applies to you. As I say, all results are anonymous. We're not going to be harvesting people's credentials, unlike the guys who broke into SolarWinds. Charlotte, it would be remiss of me not to ask then, in terms of the attribution. Being a journalist, this has been classified as a nation state attack by a lot. That's been attributed to Russia. Some people attributing it to the Russian SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Services. Have you seen that attribution, and what do you make of it?
Look, I don't know any more about the attribution than you do, Jeff, to be honest. Fingers are pointing very readily and very hungrily at Russia. And there seems to be a lot of circumstantial evidence that supports that. Plus, the background intelligence, what we know about their capabilities, their standard modus operandi, etc. But I don't think that one can say anything beyond the fact that I think we would all fall over on our backs if it's not a nation state player.
Yeah. Just that was the thing, because so many people were compromised, and in the end, or potentially compromised, and in the end, the actual target list of people that were hit was so small, and so seemed to be so selective. I guess that's one thing that's feeding into people's logic about this. If you were a cybercrime gang, you would have monetized your 18,000. Let's have a look. Results are in. So 12%. Which is the leader? Interesting. So most people have not asked about it, done investigations, or questioned their partners or suppliers, but a quarter have done all of the above, asked about it, done investigations, and questioned their partners and suppliers about it. Really interesting in terms of the fallout. Again, there's time at the end to ask about questions about all of this, and if you've got points to make or points to raise, please do stick those in at the end. We'll leave some time there. But I just want to go back to the actual SolarWinds attack itself in terms of sort of causes of this. I mean, Nicola, you've been patiently observing Charles' comments there, and I was getting around to the point of attribution. As Charles said, there's still a lot of missing components there, a lot of missing information, but people seem to be coalescing around the fact that this is a nation state attack. And if so, of course, it's by far not out of the ordinary. I just wondered if you could sort of put this in context for us, the actual background causes of the SolarWinds attack, particularly as regards government hacking.
Of course, in that case, we have all the components that can designate that SolarWinds affair concerning the way it is organized, the agenda. Exactly as Charles said, most of the time when you have this very long run campaign of attack, several months between when the malware and the guys entered into the information system and circulated into that information system, and the fact that obviously only state interests are concerned.
Oh, I've lost Nicola. I don't know, Charles, are you still there?
Yeah, I can't hear him either.
Oh dear, never mind. Well, we'll come back to Nicola. Maybe there's a bit of a connection problem from France. But Charles, in terms of these sort of wider causes, there's also issues around what you call security debt, which we talked about in the past. But explain what you mean by security debt, and how does security debt, as you define it, feed into the causes behind SolarWinds?
Yeah, so we argue that supply chain attacks. Oh, there's Nicholas.
Sell to the private sector. Just a point concerning what you said. In fact, the question of trust is very important, because we were in a context where states don't want to assume the fact that they have the capacity to deal with that kind of subject internationally on a very large basis. When in the diplomatic discussion, obviously responsibility, you mentioned the case of Russia, you mentioned the case of in prior organizations with China, and obviously when Charles talked about Stuxnet, the question of the common responsibility between Israel and the United States was presented by the Iranian government, which was at the end the target of that campaign. In that field, what is sure that every country is building its own national capacity to defend itself and to attack, and the capacity to share information, even if we have for instance, if we are talking about the Western world, about the NATO, the National Atlantic Treaty Organization, where countries are supposed to put in common the teams and the technologies. As far as cybersecurity is concerned, it's still a national subject. It's dealt only by specialists nationally located, and then we are talking about cooperation. So it's very difficult for countries to admit that they will share information, except if we are very focused, very specific domain where they fear about the case of having pandemic development of a malware or of a virus on a very, very large basis, when you can find the same equipment in European countries, European administration, or in the US, or even as Charles is in South Africa, or in Asia, in countries which are using the same kind of software. So the question of the diplomatic part is very important. Why? Because you have to consider that for everything which is linked to the classic way of fighting or of organizing the war, it's quite well structured by Geneva Conventions, by the United Nations, and all the discussions which were started to try to say, okay, how can we deal to cope with that subject of fighting on cyberspace, in fact, never worked. We started the discussion beginning of the year 2000, and in fact, we are more than 20 years later, and nothing. We have meetings, we have sessions, we have declaration, which are quite nice on paper, but the question of the efficiency, and exactly as you said when Charles mentioned Stuxnet, we had exactly, it was 10 years ago when we had a very large attack on the same kind of structure, exactly as in that case of SolarWinds, targeting military organizations in the Western camp. Obviously, in that case, we didn't find the solution, despite the increase of level of of digital activity in these administration, and the fact that obviously the risk, what we are, the importance of what we can lose, what can be the impact of such attack was never so important that it is today compared to the year before. And in fact, all the legal things were absolutely great to discuss. But when we are talking about efficiency, for instance, just a word that the European countries try to say, okay, if we can't build that law into the United Nations background, maybe we can try by writing some principles under the authority of the UNESCO. The UNESCO, as you know, is in charge of culture, is in charge of arts, and as far as the digital and the internet is well appreciated to have that capacity to deliver information, to deliver culture, to deliver art worldwide. Okay, we said maybe countries, and then you see around the table some countries like China, or like even the Americans say, okay, maybe on that question we can have some discussions, but you see that there's absolutely no consensus to be very clear about what has to be allowed, what can't be allowed. Even if in the physical world we establish cruelty, we establish the fact that certain act has to be punished by international court of justice to say, okay, some things can't be done. And on that field of cyber, exactly as you said, when we were talking about the nuclear impact of Stuxnet, okay, potentially could have an impact about the nuclear plants and nuclear activity in Iran. So imagine it's far beyond only the first economic or technical impact of the attack.
Interesting. So yeah, that's a really good overview, I think, of the government hacking side and how that feeds into sort of international policy and international regime. Charles, I want to go back to you quickly because we began talking about the security debt. Can you finish off just explaining what that is and how that feeds into things like SolarWinds?
Yeah. So on the one hand, as Nicola outlined, you have governments investing in and leveraging computer hacking capabilities in a wholly unregulated, unnormalized way. On the other hand, you've got a business environment that has incentivized effectively the taking of shortcuts as far as security is concerned. And we make the argument in our paper and elsewhere that those shortcuts should be seen within the infrastructure, within the development process, within the operations of a business as debt. It's like taking a loan. You should be spending more on your security. You should be tightening these things up. You should be buying a new one. I'm not going to spend that money now. I'm going to borrow it away from my security spend and put it somewhere else, which is fair enough. That's exactly what happened now during COVID. It was necessary. Our business needs to grow, but it sits on your balance sheet like debt, and it accrues interest like debt. And eventually, someone comes calling for that debt, and we recognize and we see the debt when something like this happens. You see how under-equipped we are, how under-equipped SolarWinds was, how under-equipped the rest of us were, because we simply haven't been spending enough. And then if I may, Jeff, I think in between those two things, you've got this idea of interdependence, which is why SolarWinds is a supply chain attack, which is this idea that because we all use the same technology, we live in a technology monoculture with layers and layers and layers of shared libraries, device drivers, source code, open source, modules, platforms, open source operating systems. It's all kind of shared across between us. And then, of course, we're also interlinked with each other via the internet and VPNs and all of that. What you see is that debt is then shared across us all. So if you think of the debt that's having been accrued by SolarWinds, every time somebody downloaded SolarWinds, they were taking on a little bit of that debt. And of course, that was added to their own debt, if you like. And so interdependence is this idea that you can't think of risk, or particularly you can't think of impact in terms of a individual business and what the downside is for it. Every time there's a security failure somewhere, it has implications elsewhere in this web that the sort of modern technology and business world has created. And those three factors collectively, we argue, is why something like SolarWinds had to happen, and is why something like SolarWinds will probably happen again, unless those things can be counted or adjusted for.
It's interesting. I'm going to want to come back to Nicola shortly, because there's some really interesting points I want to raise about the whole intergovernmental side of it. But Charles, the point you've raised there, I find interesting because it does have some echoes, I think, of the monetary crisis that we went through, the financial crisis, in terms of debt securitization, the idea that everybody was basically paying into the same pool, and the hole was getting bigger, but nobody was actually filling the hole in. But I just want to, here's a sort of devil's advocate argument then, in terms of your organization's security budget. you can make yourself as tight as you possibly can, but if somebody down the chain is weak, then that's just going to affect you the same. So
Yeah.
is it possible, you know, hypothetically, what if we kind of made our security budgets communal? Is that how we should go? Everybody pays into a sort of community. How would that work?
Oh my God, Jeff, you know, like I think that's I think it's a topic for an entirely new podcast. And I think it's a very interesting idea, and I've been sort of speculating about the idea. But the irony is there's a name for this, and this is maybe a great segue to the question directed at Nicola. There's a name for exactly that model that you discussed, and it's called government and tax. You know, there's this idea that we collectively pay into a budget, and that somebody else on behalf of us all, you know, puts processes, policies, law enforcement, border control, incident response, or puts it in place. But we're not doing that. We're all focused on our own silos. And yeah, I'm not, as a sort of a little bit of a libertarian, as a anarchist and a you know, as a hacker, I'm not entirely comfortable making this argument myself. I was sort of surprised to find it coming out of my mouth. But that discussion has to happen, and it will continue to happen at a greater rate. And it needs to include the question about, so Jeff, it needs to include the question about whether we're okay with the government deploying military-grade capabilities in a civilian space. Because in the real world, that wouldn't happen. You've got intelligence, you've got prime intelligence, but your national intelligence and military apparatus don't operate in the space that we are, which is, as SolarWinds, you know, illustrates, not the case in cyber.
But this is why I want to come back to Nicola now, because the picture you painted before about the way governments were interacting or not interacting with each other doesn't paint a very optimistic picture of if we're reliant on governments, as Charles said, and if that's partly, you know, the solution, the sort of catfighting that's going on amongst the governments, not entirely helpful. How do you see this shaping up?
In fact, the only way for governments was to enact law that say, okay, you have rules about cybersecurity, and I will sue companies if they don't fulfill all these conditions. That's what they said, to try to say, okay, we will force companies, despite the economic background, the fact that, for instance, industries which are doing small margin and say, okay, I do small margin, and then I'm not able to find the cash to invest, to spend more on doing something which is not something that I can promote, to sell my products or my services in a more expensive way. So difficulty is for companies to admit that, okay, it's not only a potential future a risk, but it's something that can happen just today or tomorrow morning. In fact, that's legislation. That was the beginning of the capacity of states to say, okay, we will put some rules, we will put some fines if you are not respectful of these criteria. The difficulty is that, in fact, we are in a world when Charles started to say, okay, we have the military activity, we have the state activity, and we have the business and the commercial world. In fact, the principle of this new environment is porosity among all these universes. Why? Take one example. 2017 in the US, you had a major attack against Equifax, which is a huge broker of data in the US. The hack of personal data was more than 143 million Americans concerned by that hacking, about very detailed, very precise, very accurate information concerning individuals, 143 million of US citizens. And if we ask the first view, we could consider, okay, it's criminal organization because they are interested by taking these data, sell these data, use identity fraud, and all the business around the fact around the personal data. And so Equifax, few months later, 2019, was downgraded by the financial rating agencies like Moody's, Standard & Poor's, by saying, okay, you are bad in cybersecurity. So it's interesting to see that the question of the financial point of view, the financial community, it's outside the IT guys, the guys just focused on cyber or focused on IT. That's the real, the lawyers, the investor, the financial community, which says, okay, you are in trouble because you are not safe on as far as cybersecurity is concerned. And in February 2020, if you are visiting the website of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you have a section on the website saying, okay, the most wanted criminals. And it's part of the Western era when they were with the wanted notes on the wall saying, okay, among these most wanted criminals, you have Chinese officer from the PLA, the People Liberation Army. And that's thing that every analyst could imagine it could be, even if that's a very massive hack of a huge database. Okay, it seems it has all the characteristic, quite short period of time between the attack and the exploit of that data. And in fact, we see that state are using, and obviously it will depend of all the potential one-day trial, if the trial occurs, which is absolutely no guarantee about it. But you see that in that case, the US administration is saying that the military capacity of a great country like China was used to take the control of very, very civilian data as the personal data of US citizens. So in that case, the porosity among these worlds is absolutely the new trend. So it means that no one can say, okay, I'm working in a very civilian, peaceful, and very, not highly strategic sector, so I'm not concerned by all these fields, because you see that the what we name that the supply chain, the fact that the capacity to be interconnected, and that in fact, as far as malware has absolutely no is not disturbed to navigate into these organizations. In fact, that's a case that say, okay, and in this perspective, we start to talk about this pandemic. It was a word before, and now, alas, it's a reality in certain parts of the world as far as the sanitary point of view is concerned. But in fact, we see that, yeah, as far as we are interconnected, and that's why what happened 10 years ago with Stuxnet is something, obviously, during this 10-year period, obviously, we intensified the level of digital everywhere for every kind of part of activity. And our capacity to work without that IT support, without digital support, is became to be very, very limited. And so that's why the idea was to say, okay, we start by writing law, law concerning what you have to do, the level of cybers that you have to reach, but and the idea is by adding these very legal rules, then we will try to build something, because you will have to force leaders, business CEOs and executive committees to say, okay, even if that's not on your precise agenda, you have to take that in consideration, because otherwise you will fragilize the entire community.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I'm interested in this split between sort of private industry and government and military, and the sort of leaking across with that. And I do wonder whether countries that historically have been better at this kind of stuff, notably Russia and China, are better at it because in their societies, the bleed across between military, government and private is, in the UK, that's sacrosanct. We don't cross those lines. They are divided up, whereas in other societies, they're not divided up as much. Anyway, it's pure speculation from me as a moderator there. But Nicola, I wondered if, we haven't touched on the point of insurance in terms of sort of industry responses, and you talked about financial responses. Is insurance driving a lot of change here?
But
and also
insurance
with something like SolarWinds, I also wondered, how would insurers deal with SolarWinds?
The difficulty, the business model of insurance is very simple to understand. The insurance company will analyze and estimate a risk, and then if you have the amount of money that you risk to lose if that risk occurs, okay, they say if you lose, if there is one chance out of two that your business will be dead, depending of that event. Okay, no difficulty. You will have to pay every year 50% of the value of your business, and then if it happens one out of two, then I will finance the risk if that risk is occurring. So the difficulty is once you are facing the risk of disturbing or destructing massive organization, massive economic, administrative, the medical thing. So the question of insurance is absolutely, in theory, one of the answer, but practically difficult to imagine. So that's why the idea will be to say, okay, you will have to work on the very to make quite strong basis of your information system with very classic rules. Sorry, but these are criteria that exist for a long time to say, okay, what are your data? What is the value of your data? Did you isolate these data? Did you duplicate this data? Is these data available somewhere else? And you can take it back if needed, and all that kind of very old, very classic, very known principles, but very difficult to do it when you are dealing with a global organization which is producing data every single second, which is depending of the continuity of service, which is depending of the trust that you can have in your equipment, in your infrastructure. So okay, we know what is good, like, you know, not smoking, eating fruits and vegetables, all that rules that we all know, but okay, it's not the difficulty is to make it real in the everyday life. So but the only way out that we can think about is to say, okay, you will have to be stronger on your very strong basis, and then for the new technologies, the one that are not clear.
We may have lost Nicola. There's a little bit of delay in the clearly the line from France is a bit delayed. Charles, can we come back to you though quickly, because in terms of, again, fallout and ramification of this, there's issues, isn't there, around balkanization and around, you know, countries starting to take stances against each other technically, politically, and so on.
Yeah, you know, I as you know, Jeff, I'm a South African and an African, and so you know, we view the world sometimes through a slightly different lens. And one of the things that I think is interesting when conflict between countries, which is, I think, what this is, plays out on a global stage and in cyberspace, is clearly what's going to come out of this at some point or another is going to be attribution, and then the conflict between those two countries is going to escalate. Let's call it America and Russia, although, you know, we can't confirm that it's Russia. And the way that conflict manifests is, on the one hand, with, you know, the throwing of cyber bullets across the pond at one another. But the other way is, it can very clearly be seen in a process that we call balkanization, which is really the splintering of the internet, or splintering of cyberspace. So we see Russia, for example, talking about RUNET, Russian-only almost intranet for that country, that, you know, would arguably protect them from outside interference, not just you know, technical cyber warfare, but also information warfare, disinformation campaigns, etc. And on the American side, you know, we see them banning Huawei, getting all riled up about TikTok, etc. And that's driven by national security concerns, at least ostensibly. But that positioning doesn't work when it's done only between two countries. So in South Africa, for example, and in Africa, countries are being approached by the Americans with something called the Clean Net Initiative, I think, which basically is a contract that they're being asked to sign that says, you'll follow our lead in terms of technology choices, at this point meaning you won't buy Huawei, and then we'll play nice with you. But if you don't follow our lead and you continue to buy from Huawei, you're putting us at risk, because we don't then trust your infrastructure, and we can't communicate with you, we don't want to support you, etc. So we're not going to play nice with you. Now, the problem is that smaller countries are going to be forced to choose sides, right? If you're Lesotho, for example, who has signed the Clean Net Initiative, they're now firmly in bed with America, and that process of isolating them from Russian influence, Russian technology, Chinese influence, Chinese technology is just going to accelerate. So they're now in bed with America. They're beholden to their policies, probably strong-armed into buying their technologies, and they sort of become, forgive my political exuberance here, but sort of become, technology vassal states of the state. On the other hand, if in South Africa we say, no, we're too invested in Huawei, we're not going to do that, you might find the opposite process happening. And so the map that we see in front of us in South Africa and Eastern Europe, in Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia, across into South America, all over the developing world, we're going to see countries orienting around the superpowers, which sort of sounds philosophical on the one end, and maybe it is, maybe it's just about like how we imagined the internet would be and how it turns out to actually be. But I think for security planners, for buyers, for strategists, it's something that we need to start thinking about also, is the origin, the national origin of technology. Yeah. Just a last bit on that, Jeff, we also, we hear people talking about indigenous and semi-indigenous software now, from a cyber conflict point of view. So it is becoming real, and it's something that's going to grow more on the agenda because of incidents like SolarWinds.
Yeah. It's really interesting. There's a sort of nation-state kind of governmental level of the supply chain issue of, well, we have relationships with all these countries. How do we manage those relationships so that those countries are safe for us to be surrounded by online, as it were? We've had loads of really good questions come in. Actually, and I'm going to ask, we've got about 10 minutes left or so. If you've got more questions, by the way, do keep asking them. Apologies, Nicola, I'm not quite sure what the connection is. We're going to try and get him back in the best traditions of live broadcast news. So hopefully Nicola will come back. But comments were really good when he was there, so I hope you got a lot out of that. Question for Charles, more of a comment than a question for Charles. It makes you think, though, about the command and control domains, if there should have been more to make sure they are fully blocked, as in the command and control domains that were used in the SolarWinds attack. This may add a blockage to the attacks, and not so much on normal filtering, perhaps on a special rule on all firewalls. Would that have worked? I suppose we would have had to have known what the CNC domains were, but if we'd known that, would that have been a way to stop it?
Well, now that we know, we obviously are stopping it. That's clearly, in fact, what Microsoft and the US government and FireEye have done is to black hole those domains, which is one of the ways. In other words, they claim the domain, and so all the traffic from those compromised machines then goes to servers that they control, and that's how that's in part how our list of victims is growing. So that is a response, but in terms of prevention, God, it's a losing game, and the attackers can register any domain. The domain registrars clearly are incentivized to sell as many domains as they can, not to differentiate between good guys and bad guys when they sell the domains. That particular domain that they used is very innocent and innocuous looking. There's no reason, and it was only actually deployed 2 years after it was registered. So other logic that we have that says, 1 day old domains are suspicious, which we have rules for, that wouldn't have worked. So yeah, in retrospect, of course, but
yeah, tricky.
There's not too much we can do now.
Tricky. Nicola, welcome back. I'm glad we've got you back.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's an up and down connection from Paris. There's a question here for you. There are so many regulatory requirements for companies to comply to, specifically around third parties. Does it mean the regulators and their proposed controls are ineffective? So the 109 compromised companies, has someone checked their compliance levels prior to the attack to see if regulatory compliance actually helped them or not? It's a good question, because we have all this compliance. Can we correlate the companies that complied with the ones that didn't get hit by SolarWinds, for example?
But it's difficult because we do not have a full picture about the victims, and SolarWinds were, as we noticed, the target were specifically concentrated into the administration and on a very strategic field. So it's a very interesting case, but maybe it's not the one that can be enlarged to all situations. But first of all, the fact that legislation had a very important advantage. First of all, it put an agenda. So it means most of the time it has to be enforceable by a certain date, and so it forced the executive committee to say, okay, at that date you must reach that level, otherwise you are responsible, or you will you can be sued, or you can have to pay a fine. Second point is, by precisely by the question of the fine, it helps to put a price on the cyber risk. For instance, if you take the case of the European legislation on the personal data, saying that the maximum amount of the fine could be up to 4% of the worldwide turnover. Obviously, it's a question, even for a big transnational firm, it's an amount, because you have to add the lawyers, the consultants, you have to add all the mandatory investment around. So it put a price on the question. When I said about the fact that some executive committee consider that the small margin that they do on business make difficult the fact to spend money on it. Okay, once you have to face that. And last but not least, keep in mind that in that case of legislation, your victim will be in front of the state, but in front of the customers. If you take the example of the personal data, it could be the one from your employees, the one from your customers. So it's difficult to justify to your community, once you are spending millions of dollars or euros or pounds about marketing campaigns, saying, okay, I do care, you are absolutely I'm a user-centric organization. And when it's time of protecting what is concerning you directly, your data, you're a bit weak. So it's difficult. So the question of legislation is to say, okay, it's one good point. Second point is, we start to see some company which are not authorized anymore to participate to or to markets, to contract with others or with public administration if they can't justify their level of security. That's the question of the supply chain that we define. The fact that, okay, I'm not a single entity, I'm always one interconnected to the other. And obviously, during the phase of social engineering, the hacker will spend time, and I would say invest time, to look at the weakest element on the chain, to be sure that he will be able to enter there and then navigate into the system. So the difficulty is, as far as legislation is concerned, that, and we have the case in certain in the case, for instance, in the e-commerce, when countries decided to enact very strong law, some companies can decide to say, okay, I will not do business in that country anymore, because the price or the cost to fulfill all these criteria is too expensive. So that's a question. Legislation can be on the two side, but the stock market, the investors, I would talk about a very, very financial community. For instance, take the example of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, is asking, after a hack concerning a public company, to say, okay, you suffered a hack, too bad, but I want to investigate, and I am only a financial authority. I'm nothing to do with IT, nothing to do with even with cyber, but I'm a financial authority, and I want to have a clear view, and you will have to justify what did you do to protect, to avoid. You didn't avoid the attack, obviously, but what did you do to limit the impact of such? And we have exactly the same, for instance, with very organizations which were only in the past concerned by financial questions. For instance, the European Central Bank in the past was doing on a very classic way for the industry of banking on insurance, some financial stress test. Okay, do you have money enough in your account to, in case of financial crisis, to resist in front of the financial crisis? It's very classic. But now all these very financial organizations are doing some exercise on cyber stress test. Are you ready to resist? Is your organization ready to resist to cyber attack dealt by state, by criminal organization, by former employees, who knows? But in case that it will be it start to be a very strong criteria of the capacity of doing business on the long run.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Charles, a question here for you, which is an interesting one, slightly taps into what we've talked about before. But the question is, if you trust a software vendor and if you've performed due diligence, are you always going to be compromised if they are breached? Is there a risk of a nation state compromising Windows updates and owning all the Windows boxes in the world? Good question, that I thought.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think that's the point. That's what this illustrated. I think it's very unlikely, but I think it's possible. I mean, I saw another question here also that spoke about whether there's anything that SolarWinds customers could have done to defend themselves, and those two questions I think kind of overlap. So maybe it's worth talking about that. I don't think that there's anything. This is a terrible thing for a security guy to say, but I don't think we can realistically, with the budgets and the realities that we operate in, inevitably prevent compromises from happening. Whether it's nation state or an employee who slips and falls on a phishing email, or someone who walks out the door with a laptop, or whatever the case is. I just think there's too many variables stacked against us. But I think we can do better at minimizing the dwell time, if you like, tightening up our internal networks. We can segment better. We can control authentication better. We can enforce multi-factor authentication better. We can improve our monitoring, not just of the network, but how FireEye detected the attack was because at one point the attackers were trying to access, I believe they were trying to access like Azure Cloud or Office 365, and they were trying to provision a mobile phone for multi-factor authentication. And the engineers at SolarWinds picked up that the account was being authenticated from a different phone because they were properly monitoring for anomalies all across their estates. And then, as I said, I think you need to be ready for, and you need to be practiced at responding quickly. And by that I don't mean, obviously it means having an incident response team in place, but it also means like, are we ready to communicate? Do we have our backups? Have we practiced? Do we do fire drills, etc. I think that's where the focus needs to be. Jeff, and if I may, just one last thing. There was also a question about deception technology like honeypots and canaries.
Yes.
And I think that's a very good example of better detection. I think there's an argument that deployed correctly, deception technologies give us very high detection ROI for exactly this sort of thing. But they're only useful if somebody's watching them, and if you've got that team that can investigate, and if you're ready to deploy the forces when it's triggered. Otherwise, you're also wasting your time.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. We are almost out of time on that. So listen, there's 2 handouts there that you can download, Orange Cyber Defense handouts in the little chat window there. So feel free to grab those and run away with them and have a look at them. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've learned a ton about SolarWinds and the deeper ramifications of it that I didn't know. I hope you have too. I'd like to thank our panelists for that. Charles van der Walt, who's Head of Security Research, and Nicolas Arpesian, who is Director of Strategy and Public Affairs at Orange Cyber Defense. Thanks so much for popping along. I've been Jeff White. I've been your host. By the way, my book, crime.com, is available at all good bookstores. May well get that plug in just there. And look forward to seeing you again at another Orange Cyber Defense event soon, possibly even in person. Who knows how things go. Take care meanwhile, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Cheers.